Welcome back to Pachehra Talks. Today we are going to explore the another concept in security for Azure AKS. We are talking about the best practices or how to secure Azure resources in our security specific series. And today we are going to secure Azure AKS, the best practice for authentication and authorization. We've already covered multiple videos for the cluster security, and this one is for authentication and authorization. As we already know, Kubernetes doesn't have its own identity management solution. Hence, we can easily integrate this with Entra ID. Now, if the question is why Entra ID, it's very simple. First of all, you're running Azure AKS. This is on Azure. You already have identity solution. Why you want to create multiple username and passwords, right? Second, it will give you a centralized identity management. Let me write this down here for the sake of our convenience. Okay, it has some delay. All right, we got it. Centralized identity management. Okay. Now, if it is a centralized identity management, that means we'll have unified access because Entra ID or Azure AD provides a central place to manage user identities and their access to various services, including Azure Kubernetes services. The centralization makes it easier to control who has access to Kubernetes resources, hence the enhancement in the security. Then we can get the consistency. How? Because user information groups and roles defined in Azure AD are consistent across the organization, reducing discrepancies and simplifying compliance and enhancing your security. Now, as I said, we need not to go and maintain multiple username password, which is not a good practice. So Azure AD or Entra ID provides you SSO, which is single sign-on, seamless access, because Azure AD or Entra ID has that inbuilt SSO feature, meaning users can access multiple applications, including AKS, with one set of credentials. And this minimizes password fatigue and reduces the risk of password related security breaches. And because Entra ID is going to be our identity management solution for Kubernetes in Azure or Azure AKS, then all the wonderful features that Entra ID offers, we can easily leverage them. For example, MFA, which is multi-factor authentication, a stronger authentication, and we all know by adding just one more factor for authentication, it can save up to 99% of attacks related to the authentication. Yeah, I'm not saying it, I'm not making it up. It is it's there on the Microsoft. All right, so Azure AD multi-factor authentication requires additional verification steps like phone notification or SMS code or application through application code beyond the password. That reduces a huge risk of unauthorized access. Then we can also utilize conditional accesses, which is like policy-based security, and Azure AD's or Entra ID's conditional access feature allows administrators to enforce certain policies based on users' location, device, or risk factors. All right, so we can give some example here. Like you can maybe you require MFA for logins from unfamiliar locations or block access altogether for certain geographies. Can easily be done through CA because if you are asking for MFA every time you are just accessing this, which is again is a fatigue for the users, they will like why I have to do it again and again. So conditional access can help there, single sign-on can help there, and of course, uh, the best part is along with all those features that Azure AD or Entra ID offers, we can, as it has already shown here, integrate this Azure AD or Entra ID directly with this Azure AKS. It is right there when you create the cluster. It is not like earlier where you have to create your application and type in all those IDs. It is very simpler now. And we can utilize the RBAC of Azure AD, granular permissions, by integrating Entra ID with AKS RBAC. You can control access at granular level as well. You can map Azure AD groups to Kubernetes roles and restrict access to specific namespaces, resources, or API calls. And because it is Azure AD, all the users are there, so audit and compliance becomes very easy because it has all those loggings. So audit and compliance, which is again an important part of any secure organization. And then simplified onboarding and offboarding, which reduces administrative overhead, like adding or removing user access is simplified through Azure AD group management. When an employee leaves the organization, removing their Azure AD account automatically revokes their access to all the places, including Azure AKS. So we can have this simplified onboarding or offboarding. Right, that is again important thing, because if you forgot to remove the user which has left the organization, it is still there, still got the access, again it's a threat, right? And yeah, there are so many things which Azure AD and TriID offers when it's integrated with the Azure AKS. Now let's quickly check the process, how it actually work. Now, as you see here, this is the first black box is your Azure subscription. In the Azure subscription, we are running AKS cluster, or we run Azure resources in the Azure subscription. One of the resources, Azure AKS cluster. Now, Azure AKS cluster has like master and node, worker node. Worker node is something that we have the access to. So I've created worker nodes here. And now there's two kind of things. Control plane, where we to get the access on the Azure resources to manage the Azure resources, right? Like create the Azure VM or increase the size, disk, things like that. And another access we need to work on the resources, like inside the virtual machine. If you're doing something, you should have different kind of access, which is like data plane. Same concept applies here. For example, before we go there, our VMs are like domain joined. So when you access the VM, you have to type in domain credentials and password to start working inside the domain joined virtual machine. That is your data plane, right? And when you log into the Azure portal, that is your control plane. From Azure portal, you can shut down VM, you can delete VM. You're working on the control plane. But when you're logging inside the virtual machine, then you are working on a data plane. If with the similar concept, if you are getting inside the AKS cluster, okay, once you're getting inside the AKS cluster, and all the resources of AKS like namespace, pods, daemon sets, things like that, services and all, are the AKS resources. And AKS or Kubernetes doesn't have its own identity solution, but it can create role, which means permissions, and we can bind those permissions to the users. Binding, which is called binding, right? Now, to work on this data plane, we need to work with the Kubernetes RBAC, not the Azure RBAC, but the Kubernetes RBAC. There are like two things here. We are talking about two things here. One is Azure Entra ID user and groups. We are doing Azure Entra ID RBAC and Kubernetes RBAC. Now, the first thing is authentication, right? And what is authentication? It is like you're proving who you are. Azure AD or Entra ID is handling the authentication, providing access token to authenticated users. Because this Entra ID is linked with Azure subscription, so it is taking the authentication responsibility and sharing token to this user who gets authenticated, and AKS API verifies these token and identifies the user. For example, if there is a user sitting here, ting, 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 try to access AKS, then it will direct it to the Azure AD credential. It will put it credential and it will provide the token which is verified by the Azure AKS API like this. Okay. All right. So that is authentication. Now, authorization means Kubernetes RBAC ensures that authenticated users only have permissions to perform the actions allowed by their roles, and that authorization is done through the Kubernetes RBAC. I'll show you the YAML file that will make it simple. But for now, try to be with me and understand the concept, which is more important. Okay. So there are two things are happening. As I said, authentication, Azure AD will give the token to the user. Now it can access the Azure AKS cluster. Then the authorization. Okay. So first RBAC is on the control plane who can access the control plane Azure resources. Second RBAC is Kubernetes RBAC who can work on the data plane or the Kubernetes resources. And this RBAC is done with the help of role, just like any other RBAC. Role means permissions. Once we have the permission, what we need to do, we need to bind that permission to the user. Now here we can use these user, Kubernetes user. We can not the QNet, but the enter ID user or group. We can use these things in the binding. Now we have two kind of roles and binding, like roles or cluster role binding and cluster role binding, which means inside the cluster or entire cluster. That's a simple difference. We have already completed in our AKS series, but here this thing is important. Now let me show you this. Okay. All right. Let me do this. Oh no. Oh no. 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 Hmm. Now, this is our nodes. This is our user who has permission to access. Uh, if he wants to access the node, he needs permission. And how we get the permission in the AKS? Through role. And how this role will get permission to the user with the help of this binding, right? And how this binding happens? Through enter ID users. And why this guy will trust the enter ID? Because there is an integration between AKS and the enter ID. That's how. Well done. Let me show you this. This is the authentication authorization, the source of this video. Now here you can see Kubernetes lacks an identity management solution for you to control resources with which users can interact, right? Now, the second thing, YAML file. See, with the YAML file, we are creating a Kubernetes resource. This resource is role. And once we have the permission on finance app full access role inside the finance app, that's why it's role, not the cluster role. Cluster role is for the entire cluster. This is for the namespace only. And next thing is role binding. Now we are binding with whom? We are binding with user. And who is that user? There is a contoso.com, which is coming from, uh, see here. They have full permission to the resource pipe because it is coming from enter ID. Okay, it is coming from enter ID, as this email address is from enter ID. All right, as you can see under access and identity, we have roles and cluster roles that I was talking about. It is the permission, right, with the Kubernetes RBAC. Cluster role learns and applies permission to resource entire cluster, not a specific namespace. Okay, then we have the role bindings and cluster role bindings that I showed you in the YAML file. And here you can see both RBAC comes into the picture right here. Authorization is done by both the thing. How? Because Kubernetes RBAC YAML file will utilize the enter ID users and groups that can be done. So yeah, that's it. This is the authentication and authorization for Kubernetes, and these are the security features. So what is the best practice? Is integrated with Entra ID and utilizing Entra ID groups to bind the role and cluster role in the Kubernetes cluster. We can utilize all those advanced features of Entra ID and one place for all those things. All right. Well, thank you for watching. I hope it was informative and you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.